Climate change is hazardous for human populations, but it's also hazardous for ecosystems in general. There's a number of ways, and we'll just go through a few here. Ecosystems in general are shifting towards the poles, so north in the northern hemisphere, south in the southern hemisphere, and they're also creeping up to higher altitudes. And that's because they're trying to find that good sweet spot where they're at the right temperature for them. And so some examples are that they're finding non-native shrubs surviving and spreading across Alaska and Canada, things that didn't used to grow there. This can cause issues for the native plants that are there. They might be outcompeted. We also see birds are migrating north in the northern hemisphere, or south and southern, and they're doing this earlier, and they're starting to breed earlier. Plants are budding out earlier in the spring. And when you combine these two factors together, this causes some species to be out of sync with their food sources. So the birds may be traveling north earlier because it's warm and they feel like it's time to go, but when they get there, they may not get there at the right time when their food source is ready and available for them. So as a result of this, scientists predict that just a 2-degree Fahrenheit temperature increase may increase extinction risk for species for 30% of all species. So this is a huge amount. Just a small temperature change can increase the risk of extinction by a lot. There are some ecosystems, that are particularly sensitive. So an example of this is the Arctic and subarctic and Antarctic areas, so the polar regions. These areas are experiencing the most dramatic temperature increases on Earth. Many creatures depend on the sea ice in these areas, and the sea ice is starting to go away. So we see a picture here of polar bears walking on ice. And what we know is that as that Arctic ice is thinning out, polar bears swim from ice area to ice area in the ocean as they seek out prey. And then they sit on the ice and wait for seals to pop up, and then they eat them. And so polar bears are swimming longer from one ice area to another. Sometimes they're drowning. Other times they're just expending more energy, and that causes them to get very thin. And they're having fewer babies also as a result. In areas in the northern and very southern latitudes, there's permafrost in the ground. And permafrost is found a few inches below the surface of the soil, and that's soil that's permanently frozen. But now permafrost soil is thawing, and as a result, trees and plants and even people's houses that were on the surface are starting to sink in. That soil becomes very mushy and kind of like a boggy soil, and so these plants and houses sink into the soil as that permafrost thaws. So we see another picture on the slide of what they're calling drunken trees in Siberia. These trees are all tilted at weird angles because the ground underneath them is no longer stable, and they're sinking into that once frozen soil. Other particularly sensitive systems include areas like coral reefs. Coral reefs are very sensitive to high temperatures and increasingly acidic oceans, and that causes the coral to bleach. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. We also see tropical rainforests. When there's a drought in tropical rainforest, the trees and plants that live in that, and even animals that live in that rainforest, they're very sensitive to small changes in temperature and rainfall, because typically rainforests are very steady in terms they have fairly steady temperature and steady rainfall year-round. And so now they're experiencing more times of drought and warmer temperatures, and so these plants and animals are having trouble adapting to that, and they're even experiencing more wildfires. Finally, we see desertification taking over in parts of the world. So areas that are near desert but used to be grasslands or other kind of fertile land is now turning into desert as we see more droughts in that region, and as people are overusing the limited water resource available in that region. So the Sahel region here is shown in a picture. This is across Central Africa and like a band across Africa. And the Sahara Desert is slowly creeping into that region, which used to be usable land, and now it's becoming more desert land. So just to kind of talk about coral bleaching in more detail, because that's something we hear about a lot with climate change. What does that mean when it's bleached? So basically, coral systems live in a symbiotic relationship. The coral lives with an algae, and when the coral gets stressed, the algae leaves the coral. And then the coral is very vulnerable to pollution and sunlight, and so it can die more easily. And so it's better for it to have that algae present. So when we talk about bleaching, that means that the algae has left the coral and exposed it to hazardous conditions.